Good morning, everyone, and a very warm welcome to NUPI Russia Conference 2025, both those present here at Centralen and those following us online. This year's conference theme, Russian power practices and repertoires of power, could hardly be more timely. We ask, how does Russia exercise power? What instruments does it use to gain influence, politically, economically, militarily, and symbolically? And crucially, how have these practices evolved in the wake of Russia's full-scale invasion of Ukraine in 2022? The conference presents the main findings from the RUSMENA project, funded by the Research Council of Norway and led by research professor at NUPI, Jakub Godzimiski. The original plan of the project was to examine Russian power practices in the MENA region, the Middle East and North Africa. However, after Russia's invasion of Ukraine, the project team decided to adopt a comparative approach and examine Russia's actions in the Black Sea region. By comparing these arenas, the project provides new and deeper insights into how Russia combines hard and soft power and how its practices challenge existing regional and global orders. RUSMENA contributes to a broader understanding of Russia's contemporary repertoire of power. Our program today is divided into 3 parts. So first, we explore how we can study Russian power practices, both conceptually and methodologically. Second, we turn to case studies from the MENA and the Black Sea regions, focusing on the tools and tactics Russia employs and how regional actors respond. And finally, we bring together leading experts for a panel discussion on Russia's quest for recognition as a great power, as one of the key drivers of Russian policy. And now, to open the conference, it is my great pleasure to introduce our keynote speaker, Professor Derek Aver from the University of Birmingham. Professor Aver is widely recognized for his extensive research on Russian foreign policy, most recently in relation to the Middle East and North Africa. So today, he will share his insights in a keynote speech entitled Persistent Factors in Russian Policy Towards MENA. Please join me in giving a very warm applause to Professor Derek Aver.
Thank you very much for the very kind welcome. I've been here a couple of times before, but quite a long time ago now, maybe 10, 12, 14 years, something like that. And I always enjoy coming to NUPI because I think there's always a very kind of practical approach to international relations, rather than the kind of traditional international relations theory, which in my humble opinion has lost its way a bit. And I think we need really to have that much more practical focus. Anyway, that's a personal prejudice, if you like. Okay, I was asked to talk about persistent factors in Russian foreign policy towards the Middle East and North Africa. I usually prepare too much, so if somebody will give me the 2-minute signal at some point in about 20 minutes' time, I'd be grateful. Okay, so Russia's invasion of Ukraine. This topic absorbs really much of Western attention these days, but it's not the only factor influencing Russia's approach to the Middle East and North Africa. It does add a new layer of complexity that has impacted profoundly on its foreign policy. So countries across the MENA region, I call it the MENA region for short, have sought to mitigate its economic consequences. In response to ever harsher Western sanctions, Moscow has accelerated the radical shift in its political and economic alignment towards partner countries in the East and South. Meanwhile, some of the old problems remain. The Libya, Syria and Yemen civil wars, even though they've changed now and there's been a takeover in Syria and possibly some kind of accommodation in Yemen, still they are raging on in one way or another. Regional animosities and the interventions of external patrons continue to be a factor. Iran, helped by sub-state groups hostile to Israel, continued, at least until June, to provoke armed attacks by Tel Aviv. The Abraham Accords, which a lot of people seem to have forgotten about, have made very modest progress, mainly due to the negative reaction of Arab public opinion over the Israel-Palestine question. And finally, fears of a resurgence of militant Islamist forces across the region persist. Russia is still perceived by the Western powers to be exploiting their lack of resolve in order to carve out a strategic presence, even a hegemonic presence, some have argued, in the MENA region. I don't think that's the case, but I'll go into that a little bit in a few minutes. 3 years after the invasion of Ukraine, the campaign continues. In response to Western political and material support for Kiev's war efforts, with NATO initiating a potentially massive rearmament program. I'm sure a lot of work is being done in NUPI about that. And also reinforcing sanctions aimed at the long-term containment of Russia. Moscow has revised its nuclear doctrine, signalling possible nuclear strikes on states posing a direct threat to Russia's sovereignty and territorial integrity. I believe tomorrow morning there'll be a presentation by Dima Adamski about these facts, which I look forward to. Moscow has also deepened its strategic partnerships with Iran, China and North Korea, which are now being called the nuclear revisionists by the Americans. Sorry? CRINC, I saw that. I only saw that the other day, yeah, CRINC, which is China, Russia, Iran and North Korea, CRINC. That's quite a nice one, crinkly. Official NATO statements have also accused Russia of fueling tensions and instability across the MENA region by providing military technical support to Hezbollah and the Houthis. In a word, the Middle East environment appears to be even more threatening. The Hamas attacks of 7th of October 2023, as we all know, triggered a devastating response by Netanyahu's right-wing government. Massive Israeli and US strikes on Iran in June 2025 aimed at destroying Tehran's purported nuclear weapons program and curbing, I think more importantly actually, curbing its regional advances through its proxy forces, have inflicted a defeat on an Iranian leadership which was already suffering from Western sanctions. Bashar al-Assad's overthrow in December 24 has brought to power an Islamist government with roots in the militant group Hayat Tahrir al-Sham, and armed conflict in a fragmented and ungovernable Libya, linked with clashes in other African countries, continues. Authoritarian governance seems to be returning after the Arab Spring. We don't talk much about the Arab Spring nowadays, which I think is one signal of that. The contours of a new MENA regional order amid potentially profound upheaval and uncertainty are indecipherable. Another factor is the wildly unpredictable second Trump administration. It seemed intent on prioritising the Indo-Pacific region, but is reluctantly renewing its engagement in Europe and the Middle East. And this is a problem because we don't know how far it's going to go. I think that's the main problem, yeah? That adds an extra ingredient to this volatile mix. The Trump administration, shorn of diplomatic experience, is policy making often confused and opportunistic. It seems to be exacerbating rather than resolving existing security problems. Emerging fissures in the global order, collapse of the notion of collective security, and the ineffectiveness of multilateral institutions may deepen the instability of the regional MENA environment. Trump's Truth Social posts about peace in the Middle East and Netanyahu's nomination of Trump for the Nobel Peace Prize are set to occupy an honoured place in the annals of political satire. Against this wider, very bleak background, a central question posed. I published a book a couple of years ago on Russia and the Middle East and North Africa, a central question I posed at the time in the book resurfaces. How do we explain Russia's strategic thinking and policy behaviour in the context of recent changes in international and regional politics? What are the longer-term trends? What are the proximate causes? 2 points here. First, Russia's approach to the international system. Moscow has become even more intent in the last few years on waging the battle for ideas and contest for norms against what it perceives as a Western revisionism of the contemporary international legal system. Its strategic reorientation towards non-Western countries entails even greater rhetorical emphasis on the overarching principles it has long espoused. So, respect for sovereign equality, non-interference in a UN charter-based international system, pursuit of a multipolar international order underpinned by regional security orders, support for peoples demoralised by Western interventions, which have only exacerbated the problems in MENA countries, and reforming global governance institutions that meet the interests of non-Western states, strengthening their political and economic sovereignty. And this reflects what is happening at the moment. I mentioned before the shift in power to the global south and east. Second, with reference to power practices, which is obviously the heart of the RUSMENA project here in NUPI, how does Russia deal with the critical opportunities, constraints and vulnerabilities it faces in pursuit of its geostrategic reorientation? Western sanctions are inflicting substantive damage on the Russian economy, compromising its status as a great power, shaping the future of an alternative international order. The threat of secondary sanctions on countries facilitating trade with Russia is forcing them to think twice about overt cooperation with Russian businesses. The securitization of the Russian economy, in other words, a partial mobilization in response to the demands of the Ukraine campaign, may become a strategic rather than short-term measure, shaping the economies for years to come. Stable oil prices and some success in redirecting oil exports to the east and south are offset by Western embargoes on the imports of vital technologies. And one notable result, the strategic database, the SIPRI database on strategic arms exports, have noted that in the most recent 5-year period, with volumes of Russian exports to Middle East and North Africa have fallen by 83%. Also, no time to talk about in any great detail here, but trade partnerships between the Eurasian Economic Union and Middle Eastern countries may well be impacted by the lack of infrastructure and investment capacities to expedite the transportation of goods from Russia and the Middle East to eastern and southern markets. The widening membership and increasing number of dialogue partners in the Shanghai Cooperation Organization and the BRICS Plus format, including MENA states, Turkey's interest is notable in this regard. This holds out potentially substantial political and economic prospects, yet it remains unclear whether Russia will be able to capitalize on trade and investment opportunities. A few words, probably a very few words, because I sense I probably will run out of time. A few words on Russia's key regional partnerships. Russian-Iranian relations were enshrined in the January 2025 Bilateral Comprehensive Strategic Partnership Treaty. This is very much based on a common commitment to a multipolar world order and the UN Charter-based international system, as well as shared antipathy towards the West. Defence and security are high on the agenda, and certainly the future of Iran's nuclear program may be influenced by Russian-Iran military technical collaboration. Iran and its supporters in the axis of resistance, so Hamas, Hezbollah and the Houthis in Yemen, have found increased political support in Moscow. Yet, in practical terms, there's scant evidence of a paradigm shift in Moscow's relations with Tehran. Rather than a military alliance, the partnership treaty really outlines a transactional relationship limited to bilateral political, military technical and economic assistance at a time of heightened tensions. Moscow cannot afford direct confrontation with the US over Iran. Moscow's primary aim of achieving a balance of interests in the Middle East, in particular maintaining positive relations with Israel, the Gulf Arab states and Turkey, would be severely compromised by its association with a nuclear-armed Iran. Russia's political support may have encouraged Tehran's coercive posturing, but Moscow may still use its influence and experience as a signatory to the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action to encourage Iran to return to international cooperation, thereby legitimizing its civilian nuclear program and avoid being seen as an international pariah. Syria, another difficult challenge. Moscow still is trying to retain some influence with Damascus, but it must now establish relations with a new leadership consisting partly of Islamist groups which it fought during the Syrian civil war and which also seeks compensation for the damage inflicted by Russian military operations. Moscow simply cannot afford in financial terms to provide much more than diplomatic support to al-Shara's attempt to forge political consensus among the country's disparate population. Moscow must also take into account the positions of Turkey and the regional Arab powers, all of which have their own pressing interest in reshaping Syria. In fact, I would argue that for all Tehran's importance to Moscow, Turkey and the Gulf Arabs now arguably are central to Russia's future Middle East strategy. Nor can Russia do too much to influence the outcome of the Israel-Hamas conflict. US intervention, US power, and the interests of the US's regional allies, despite substantive differences among them, mean that the scope for Russia's mediation in any settlement of the Israel-Palestine dispute is very narrow. Moscow for a long time was prioritizing relations with Netanyahu to avoid a major conflict between Israel and Iran in Syria and take advantage of intelligence cooperation with Israel to deal with the threat of militant Islamists. Moscow is still reluctant to sever ties with Tel Aviv, recognizing the complexity of regional affairs and fearful of the wider regional destabilization that further armed conflict would unleash. Okay, the book I mentioned that I published, the hardback edition, the paperback edition, nobody will have bought the hardback edition because it's very expensive. I wouldn't buy it. But the paperback edition is coming out in January, so it's a lot cheaper if anybody does want to buy it. I always have this. I'm a retired academic. I can't afford anything at the moment. The hardback edition of my book concluded that far from becoming an indispensable regional power, Russia is struggling to dictate the course of events and risks becoming mired in interstate rivalries that undermine regional stability. In other words, no hegemonic power. Nothing has happened to change this conclusion. Moscow's relatively limited military strategic ambitions are designed primarily to protect its economic and trade interests and guard against a frequently hostile US presence. The constraints Moscow now faces are exacerbated by the staggering lack of accountability of the second Trump administration in prosecuting its America First policy and sidelining international institutions, encouraging a harshly realist approach by the regional powers. At the same time, Moscow does continue to engage in intensive diplomatic activity in the region. The loss of trade with Europe and other advanced economies had forced us to seek alternative ways of bypassing Western sanctions and generate the financial resources to sustain the Ukraine campaign. Its bid to maintain a presence in Syria and sustain trade, energy, investment cooperation with Turkey, the Gulf Arab states and other key MENA countries is therefore directed towards achieving what I mentioned before, a balance of interests in the region, maximising its potential for involvement in regional affairs. Russia's operations in North Africa, pragmatic or cynical, depending on your point of view, also targets relations with a number of key countries. Military support is provided by Russia's Africa Corps, sited in local military bases and supporting logistical networks in Libya and Sudan. And Moscow aims to gain influence with African governments at the expense of the US and Europe. So I probably only have 2 or 3 minutes left. Is that right? I've got a bit more. Good. I've only got 2 more pages. To conclude, I offer 3 points to consider when analysing Russia's approach to the MENA region. The first is that, despite its overriding priority of prevailing in Ukraine and mitigating the constraints imposed by the West's containment strategy, Moscow has had some success in pursuing an independent regional policy. Instead of relying on client states, its approach is leveraged through engagement with wider coalitions of states, which are often equivocal about and even unsupportive of Western attempts to marginalize Russia. In a turbulent and often conflictual environment, Moscow has a better chance of achieving its regional foreign policy aims by pursuing a pragmatic and flexible course. The notion of Russia, as I said before, as an external patron is redundant. The greater agency of the regional powers is now a major consideration, as even the US to an extent is finding out. The second point concerns the implication of Trump 2.0, the breakdown of international relations and the normalization of power politics. Moscow can hardly reconcile itself to a situation where the US disregards international diplomacy and bombs a country that has not yet produced a nuclear warhead, even though there are legitimate concerns over Iran's nuclear program. But Moscow must look beyond a strategy conceived purely in terms of undermining US influence and asserting its great power status through destabilizing policies to challenge the Western-led order. Russia's wider interests are better served by maintaining its commitment to multilateralism and flexible diplomatic engagement with the regional MENA powers, which may allow it to play a more influential role in resolving regional contradictions and tensions. And the third and final point concerns Russia's domestic legitimacy, probably the hardest thing, talking to Jakob earlier on, the hardest thing to research these days, what's actually happening in Russia's domestic politics. The full implications of the new Trump era of power politics may be yet to emerge. Russia, I always believe, has some justification in perceiving a US strategy of fostering what Moscow calls controlled chaos. Trump's call for the unconditional surrender of the Iranian leadership in June, for example, must serve as a massive warning to Moscow's defense and security elites, for whom the US hybrid war approach is perceived as a fundamental challenge to Russia's own sovereignty and legitimacy. This causes the Putin leadership, supported mainly by conservative security and business elites, to reconsolidate state structures in an effort to shore up its power, favouring force and information management that produces reactive rather than strategic decision-making and limits its range of policy options. But I would argue Russia requires political foresight and diplomatic approaches unhindered by a dysfunctional policy-making process. A clearer understanding of its national interests and the ability to anticipate as well as react to shifts in regional affairs require more efficient decision-making that is not hostage to securitized notions of international politics. The Ukraine war does appear to signal a fundamental shift towards Russia's political and economic alignment with the non-Western powers. Russia's geo-economic interests stretch from the Middle East, or as Russia often uses the Iranian term, West Asia. From West Asia through the Caspian bases to Central Asia, China, India and the Asia Pacific. And in what is becoming a major development, more and more publications on this issue, the Arctic region, or as Russians now call it, the Arcto-Pacific region. Whether Moscow can develop the structural power and moral purpose to build on its influence, including in a new regional MENA security order, remains to be seen. Thank you.
For a few questions for Derek, if there is anyone immediately in the audience. I don't really see anything, but I can. Yes.
Stunned into silence.
Hello, my name is Susanne Sabo, and my question is: what is Russia's interest in Chad, Africa?
In Chad, I think pretty much the same as. Interests across North Africa is basically to ensure Russia's trade interests, and that can best be implemented or best be sort of taken care of by gaining some kind of not only national interest in Chad, but regional interest as all in favor of Russia. There is some kind of, I wouldn't say that it's a done deal, but the Russians say that North Africa and the sort of northern part of sub-Saharan Africa provide a kind of fertile ground, given all of the turmoil there, given the sort of civil wars, etc., to actually maintain its influence. As I say, some would call it cynical, others would just call it a pragmatic course. And I think that's really what it's aiming to do across the region at the moment. I'm not a great expert on Russia's policy specifically in Chad, but that seems to me that the way it's going to go.
Okay, thank you. Any more questions? And I forgot to say, please introduce yourself shortly when there's one there and here. And okay. Sorry.
Thanks. Good morning. I'm Henrik Seip of Equinor. I would like to ask about relations between Russia and Israel. They used to be cordial, and Putin and Netanyahu were arguably close. What now? Is there anything to suggest they could find the right bonhomie again?
I think I tried to sort of explain this early on. I probably didn't have enough time to do so. I mean, even during the kind of Arab Spring worlds, sort of the 2000s into the 2010s, the first couple of decades of the century, Moscow was often supportive of Israel's approach as long as it didn't go too far. So even during the Syrian civil war, Moscow was trying to broker a deal which would ensure that that Israel would not try to take Syria apart, that it would not launch the kind of attack that we finally saw this year, in June this year, on Iran, in order to try and mitigate the worst of the fallout. Because, you know, it's obvious to most people that, you know, this is a potentially major flashpoint which could destabilize the entire region. At the same time, Putin's relations with Netanyahu, even though it was sometimes critical of some of his approaches, not necessarily the Israel-Palestine question, but because I don't think until the last few years, you know, the Middle East Quartet and Israel, etc., they were trying to find accommodation, but it wasn't really high on the international agenda, I think it's fair to say, certainly not high on the Russian agenda. As I say, Moscow's relationship with Netanyahu, Putin's personal relations with Netanyahu, you know, they were just basically trying to ensure that it didn't get out of hand too much. Obviously, the presence of the Russian diaspora, not all of which is supportive necessarily of Moscow, but nevertheless, you know, a large kind of Russophone, you know, legacy, if you like, number of people there. That was a factor as well. But also, I think that Russia and Israel had a close security arrangement. There were some sort of military technical, but I think that was only a kind of maybe a billion, a couple of billion sort of a year, if I remember rightly. So there wasn't actually a great deal of interest like that. But I think the main thing, as I say, was trying to sort of mitigate the worst of the potential wider fallout. In the recent period, the signs are that Putin and Netanyahu are still talking to each other. There is still some sort of security and intelligence cooperation, but Moscow is obviously forced, given its like overall kind of foreign policy positions, the kind of things I was talking about before, support for, you know, oppressed people, etc., etc. It's forced to criticize Israel rhetorically at the UN, etc., etc. But I still think that the relationship has not really shifted massively, and I think probably it will continue, if it can, to try to exert that kind of influence over Tel Aviv.
Great. I have Julia and then Tine here.
Julie Wilhelmsen, I'm a research professor at NUPI. Thank you so much for your talk. You mentioned several times that Russia has a broad diplomacy, working with a broad diplomacy in the MENA region. I was wondering, could you comment, has it changed? Is there any sign that diplomats are downgraded in favor of maybe Siloviki-like actors in Russia's policy in the MENA region? And is there a stronger ideological component to how policies in the MENA region are are they shaped by ideology or?
Yeah, I think this is something actually I was thinking about yesterday when I was reading through the notes, and so I didn't really have time to expound on this. I think maybe the Ukraine war, which is obviously heavily a sort of case of heavy securitization or ideologization, if I can say it, that kind of thing. I think in the Middle East now, the Russians have an extremely capable, intelligent, and knowledgeable diplomatic corps, mainly under Mikhail Bogdanov, but there are a lot of others as well. And in Moscow as well, I found when I was researching the Arab Spring, I found actually that the findings of the leading academics, such as Vitaly Naumkin and Vasily Kuznetsov, I think they're much better than a lot of the stuff I write in the West. I think they had a really good sort of understanding of what happens out there. And I think maybe that as Putin and the leadership, their immediate concern is Ukraine, maybe other issues get crowded out. Maybe this is a possibility for the diplomats, I don't want to overstate the case, but for the diplomats actually to be listened to by the Kremlin, because there's no other place they can get their information. I mean, obviously, the majors, the big business majors, the Rostechnology and all of these others, and particularly the energy giants, they are going to want to have a serious input into policy. But nevertheless, this may be counterbalanced to an extent by this, as I say, the diplomatic corps. I've been reading stuff recently about the fact that Lavrov is past his sell-by date, that he's becoming even more hawkish in his rhetoric than the Kremlin itself. But nevertheless, I think that I think still that he may sort of exert some kind of influence there. He's been fighting now for at least a decade, ever since the Syria intervention. He's been fighting with, as it was then, Shoigu, as it is now, the new sort of Ministry of Defense leadership, in order to try and bring some sort of sense into, that sort of sense that Russia can do what it likes in the Middle East. So when there was a big, when was it? I think it was around about 2014, 2015, when there was a big fuss over the fact that the Defense Ministry had announced that Russia was using Iranian bases to prosecute its bombing campaign in Syria. And that's just what the Iranians don't want, because they're a sovereign nation. So that was a big mistake. Those kind of sort of mistakes. And that's really what I was trying to explain in the last few years, in the last few words of the talk, when basically you need a kind of wider input from particularly the diplomatic, but also to an extent civil society, in how to sort of manage international relations. And maybe that in some cases, as I say, the ideologization can be pushed aside in other parts of the world by a much more kind of pragmatic and flexible approach to international affairs, particularly in key regions like the Middle East and North Africa, probably sort of, China-India relations with Moscow as well.
Good. Then I think we have time for one or two more questions. Tine?
Yes, thanks so much for an very interesting keynote. Tine Gade, NUPI. I just wanted to return to the issue of nuclear Iran, because FT wrote yesterday that there were several visits between Iran and Russia on nuclear cooperation with the technical experts. So I wonder if you wanted to comment on that, and if you think that the Russian support to the nuclear program is only for civilian purposes. Thanks.
Okay, the support is only for its civilian nuclear program. I think it is. There's been a lot of Western reports about the fact that the Russians are effectively helping Iran's nuclear weapons program. I don't think that's the case, because all the evidence points in the other direction. That, as I tried to explain, that if the Russians were to support a nuclear-armed Iran, that would unleash all kinds of hell in the Middle East. Yeah, so the Saudis, the Turks would want a nuclear weapon. once again, Israel would bomb Iran's flat. There are so many, you know, the US would be once again gearing up for a major war, and it would completely destabilize the entire region. And I can't say that, you know, there is a lot of sort of Russian commentary, particularly the kind of people who were writing for Carnegie, etc., Russians who were writing for Carnegie, who were saying that Russia profits from destabilizing the region. I don't think that's the case, because it can't possibly profit. Yeah, its own sort of trade, investment, cooperation, all these kind of things. And what I briefly mentioned, only briefly for lack of time, is the fact that if it is reorienting its geo-economic standing, if you like, you know, how would that help that? It's just not it just doesn't work. It doesn't stack up in my own mind. Without a doubt, there has been a lot ever since the mid-90s. I remember actually, I hadn't been in academia for very long, and I took an interest at the time in, because I was working on export controls, non-proliferation issues, and I did a lot of work at the time on the time when mid-1990s, 1995, where Russia signed the contract to build the Bushehr plant, yeah, which is a civilian nuclear plant. And I think that's the only place that the IAEA, the International Atomic Energy Authority, I think it's the only facility that they've been allowed back into. I read somewhere anyway, I'm not too sure. I need to look into that. And ever since then, a lot of nuclear collaboration, primarily, as I say, or exclusively for the civilian nuclear program. Rosatom is one of the very few companies in the world that can do the whole cycle of nuclear power. Yeah, through sort of building plants, through providing enriched uranium, etc., etc. It is the only, and that is a key part of Russia's high-tech sector, if you like, because really Russia hasn't got a great deal of sort of high-tech left. There is some sort of oases, if you like, of high technology in Russia, of which civilian nuclear, the civilian nuclear programs is the main one. So inevitably there is going, and why shouldn't it? If Iran can become a legitimate, member of the nuclear community, there's a lot of talk now about Iran withdrawing from the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty. The more knowledgeable, that's Western commentary, the more knowledgeable Iranian experts, and there's a great deal of, if you're working on Iran, read the Iranian experts, because there's some very good political scientists, yeah? They're saying that Iran won't withdraw, because that would signal the end of its sort of legitimacy as a civilian nuclear power. And all going right back to the Iranian Revolution in 1979, that was always the key sort of point that the Iranians were making. Yeah, that they had the legitimate right to become a civilian nuclear power, and they were not intending to build a nuclear weapon. Again, some rhetoric at the moment, some politicians, conservative politicians in Iran saying it's time that Iran changed this, and that they did announce its intentions for a nuclear weapons capability. But I think there is a lot of scope, and this is something where Moscow might help, both diplomatically and technologically. This is somewhere that Russia can actually help, and do the international community, if you like, a big favor. All right?
Okay, then I have Jakob.
Thank you, Derek, first of all, for coming and from sharing your insights with us. I would like to ask you a kind of another question, because one could have an impression that Russia has been acting in the MENA region as a kind of opportunistic great power, confronting other powers whose position in the region has been weakened, France, for instance, and UK to a certain extent. But there are also some other great powers that have made their footprint in the region much stronger. I think China. What is the kind of strategic relationship between China and Russia in this region? Because we saw, for instance, that China played a major part in making Saudi Arabia and Iran talk to each other. So if you could somehow say a few words about how this great power competition between Russia and China for influence in the region could shape the region and relations between Russia and China.
Yeah, I mean, there's definitely competition there, economic competition. China now, obviously, over the last 20, 30 years, technologically much more advanced than it was. It's got more to offer, apart from hydrocarbons, it's got much more to offer the Middle East than Russia has in terms of technology, as well as, like sort of commodities, if you like, like unfinished products, if you like. And it does it in a more sensible, a quieter way. It finances projects, and the trade turnover now of China with the Middle Eastern countries really far surpasses Russia. Russia's made a few gains recently, the kind of investment programs, etc., but they are very, very slow at coming. And China already has sort of, has already captured quite a lot of that market. That'll probably continue, but the future of the closer Russia-China partnership might mean that eventually they get together and do, collaborate on approaches. I think we're mainly talking about trade technology, supply chains and things like that, because that's really, as I said right at the end of the talk, this is really the big prize. If the Russians can reorientate its economy, if Russia can reorientate its economy, and China would be a major factor in this, then that whole from West Asia through Central Asia, through South Asia, Asia-Pacific region and the Arctic, that is something where the geopolitical and geoeconomic picture might look quite different 25 years from now. Yeah? There are problems in developing the Arctic, but China is collaborating a lot with Russia on that. So I think that overall there will be rivalries, but to try to give a sort of relatively short answer, but nevertheless there are a lot of kind of like, what's the word, kind of value added, force multipliers as well. I mean, it's sort of force multiplier that if they can work together within the sort of the overall sort of partnership treaty and overall, diplomatic and economic cooperation, then I think it could be a big win.
Okay, thank you so much, Derek. Can you all please join me in thanking Derek for this excellent keynote?
Thank you. Thank you.